Welcome everybody, and thank you for attending this 8th webinar in our series on digitalization and cybersecurity. This one is on cybersecurity standards and best practices. The first part, one of two parts. This one's on North American Electric Reliability Council, NERC, Critical Infrastructure Protection, CIP Standards. We're going to be using lots of acronyms today. I apologize for that, and we'll try to remember to explain them as we go along. But NERC CIP is one that we're going to be hearing a lot today. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and all of the participants are muted with their video turned off. You are welcome and encouraged to post questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. My colleague Jake Swanson and I will be monitoring them and we'll pass them on to the presenters as appropriate. My name is Johanna Kolemans-Beinen and I'm Senior Program Coordinator at the US Energy Association, hosting this webinar. We are based in Washington, DC, and we're a membership organization, brief introduction, an association of public and private energy-related corporations, government agencies, and we represent the broad interests of the US energy sector by increasing understanding of energy issues both domestically and internationally. As I mentioned above, this is the 8th webinar in our series on digitalization and cybersecurity, and you can find recordings of past webinars on our website at events, usa.org/events. And we are recording this one and we'll be uploading it as well, as I already mentioned. Please join us in coming weeks as we cover other areas of cybersecurity and importance to all of you working to strengthen the security and reliability of electric utilities. Next, Jamila Amodeo, Senior Energy Officer at USAID, the US Agency for International Development, will make some brief comments.
Good morning. Thank you, Johanna. Hello and welcome to our 8th webinar on the standards. This is a part of the 2 webinar mini-series where today we'll learn about NERC's Critical Infrastructure Protection Standards and utility perspective on them. My name is Jamila Amadeo. I'm Senior Energy Advisor with the Global Energy Division of the United States Agency for International Development. And we are halfway through our webinar series that consists of total of 15 webinars. They're designed to introduce the key concepts of cybersecurity in the energy sector. And that means that we're getting closer to our start of the Business Innovation Partnership Program that USAID will be implementing in partnership with the United States Energy Association. Through this program, we will invite a select number of utilities to participate in a formal 1-year program that will put emphasis on utility change management and innovation, encouraging adoption of new business models and optimal business processes. The program will entail 3 components: change management certification and coaching, advancing innovation efforts, and building technical and leadership capacity. That said, information presented in this and other webinars is beneficial not only for utilities. Policymakers, regulators, legislators, manufacturers, third-party service providers, and vendors are all welcome to attend our webinars. We see these webinars as a dialogue platform with our colleagues and partners from around the globe. As we know, participants representing over 55 countries attended our webinars so far. Today, we'll dive into a rather complex subject of standards for critical infrastructure protection. With over 200 security frameworks, regulations, standards, and guidelines to choose from, it's hard for energy companies to know which ones they should comply with. If they're mandatory, which ones should be, if not, which ones should be mandatory, and if compliance with standards means guaranteed protection. That's why we have asked our experts, Tim Conway and Dean Parsons from SANS Institute, to walk us through a key set of standards that are commonly used in the United States. NERC CIPs. Next week in part 2 of our mini two-part series of standards, we'll have leading EU cyber expert Stefano Bracco together with Christian Gabe of Innogy E.ON, who will present on ISO 27000 standards that are more commonly used in Europe, Asia, and outside of the United States. I had the pleasure of having Both Tim Conway and Stefano Bracco present at my regional regulatory working group meetings under the USAID Europe and Eurasia Energy Cybersecurity Initiative that was implemented in partnership with the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. Following those discussions, Tim and Stefano developed a paper called The Utility Regulator's Role in Promoting Security. And this is a guidance document for regulators, but it's not only for regulators. It's beneficial for, as we said, to utilities as well. With that, I would like to thank Tim Conway and Dean Parsons. By the way, Dean is joining us from Canada, for presenting in this webinar, and thank you to all for joining us today. Now I give the floor back to Johanna.
Thank you. I'm going to briefly introduce our two speakers, and then I will pass the floor to them to take it away. So today's presenters, Tim Conway and Dean Parsons, will give us a clear and concise overview of key points of the NERC CIP standards. And I know this because we did a dry run and it's a great presentation. This is an important first step for cyber professionals to use the NERC CIP standards when assessing and improving their cyber environments, as they will explain in more detail. So Tim Conway is Technical Director for ICS and SCADA programs at SANS and is responsible for developing, reviewing, and implementing technical components of the SANS, ICS, and SCADA product offerings. Recognizing the need for ICS-focused cybersecurity and training throughout critical infrastructure environments and an increased need for NERC CIP hands-on training, Tim authored and instructs ICS 456 Essentials for NERC Critical Infrastructure Protection. During his career, Tim has served as the chair of the RFC CIPC, chair of the NERC CIP Interpretation Drafting Team, chair of the NERC CIP GridX Working Group, and chair of the NBISE Smart Grid Cybersecurity Panel. Dean Parsons is a certified SANS instructor for ICS 515 teaching, ICS Industrial Control Systems Operating Technology. ICS, so ICS is Industrial Control Systems. Sorry, I've been skipping I promised to explain the acronyms and I didn't. Active Defense and ICS Incident Response, and is an active member of the cybersecurity community for IT and ICS cyber defense initiatives across North America. He has 20 years of combined experience in IT and OT cyber defense across telecommunications and critical infrastructure sectors. And for the last 8 years, Dean has led an active ICS OT cybersecurity program for an electric utility across facilities for generation, hydrothermal gas turbine, transmission, and distribution as the OT cybersecurity officer. On any given day, Dean could be dissecting packets from a plant floor, writing policies, or presenting to the board of directors. So he's going to be able to give the utility perspective on all this. And without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand the floor over to Tim and Dean.
Thank you very much. I am going to, that was fun. As soon as you stopped sharing, the whole screen changed. I was ready to click the share screen button and then it moved.
Sorry, didn't do it on purpose.
Yeah, the whole thing moved. Thank you for the introduction. Are you seeing my screen?
Looks good.
Looks good.
Yep.
All right.
I am.
We'll share video as well. So we are all here. I will openly apologize, as Johanna did as well, for not describing acronyms. We can have an entire day conversation in regards to NERC and CIP that is nothing but acronyms. But just some of them have already been described. So critical infrastructure protection and the NERC CIP set of standards is what we're going to walk through today on this webcast. And joined by Dean Parsons, who works for an organization and a utility that had to run NERC CIP programs and implement those programs. So the approach we're going to take is kind of to cover some of the, hang on one second, cover some of the NERC CIP basics, and then we'll have an opportunity for Dean to kind of walk through and talk about some of the standards where they've had struggles, some of the standards where things were kind of a natural fit and an extension of what they're already doing. and then moving into kind of the best of from the perspective of the NERC CIP standards, and ultimately into the lessons learned in areas where there has been observed failures across the legacy of these standards. Some of the standards are up into version 8, so they've been around for quite some time. Early discussions about the need for cybersecurity standards started in early 2000, ultimately with the industry kind of asking for an urgent action and the development of a standards body in 2003. So it has been quite some time, a little over 17 years of active development on these standards, so plenty of lessons learned that honestly could probably be, again, a full day of a training class to talk through lessons learned, where things have worked, and how they've been improved. So we're going to start with the NERC CIP basics as indicated here. And along those lines, as Jamila had mentioned, there's a number of standards and frameworks that are out there for electric utilities to look to as different countries consider kind of what path or what approach they're going to take. Just like we did here in North America before we started writing our own, there was a discussion around what already existed, what ISO standards existed that we could possibly leverage, what NIST standards existed that we could leverage, and if any of those were already directionally correct enough for us to simply consume and implement. And like many countries and like many organizations that are looking at a set of standards and they're trying to figure out a way for them to work within a traditional information technology environment, as well as within a operational technology environment, they often see struggles of requirements that are either geared specifically towards an industrial control system, an OT environment, that may not be strong enough requirements or cover enough of the domains necessary for their IT environment. And if they're simply looking at IT traditional standards and requirements, they really struggle with understanding how they would implement them down at a generation plant floor or in a substation environment. As mentioned, we took an effort to kind of look through some of those ISO standards, some of the NIST standards, some of the IEC standards, and NERC CIP, and sort of gathered our thoughts around that process in this paper that was mentioned earlier. Absolutely encourage everyone to kind of read this and look through kind of in a hunt for finding the standards that may fit your area best. The one piece that is probably buried in this paper somewhere is an overall concern that drove Stefano, myself, and others to kind of contribute to this paper, was along the lines of the trend we're seeing for every country, every organization to sort of look at the standards that are available and then determine that none of them are specific enough to fit their needs. So they are creating their own. And while that's wonderful in each area, that you're going to develop something that's specific to your need, it begins to create sort of this bigger picture supply chain problem of the vendor community needing to chase hundreds of different standards implementations and sort of focus product development and product capabilities towards whoever their biggest customer is that is procuring product and whatever set of standards that customer may be pursuing. And it sort of leaves the other customers and the other standards and the other kind of frameworks to the side until another large procurement happens for that set of standards. And definitely from a vendor procurement integrator perspective, it creates a significant amount of confusion in regards to what guidance are they trying to chase from a product development and long-term implementation from day to day. As we move towards NERC and CIP, we'll start with sort of the scope, which is CIP 002, kind of the scoping standard. And a really important item to call out here, and it's something that we worked on with the USAID workshops, was while CIP 002 focuses on certain parts of the bulk power system. So these areas in blue, from power generation to transmission, so from a step-up transformer, transmission lines, and circuits and substations and switch yards, ultimately down to the step-down transformer and all of the control centers that are involved in operating these assets. And these areas in blue are really where NERC and CIP focus, whereas on the distribution side, that is not where NERC and CIP has a focus. That is sort of defined and highlighted within CIP 002 and in the attachments. a interesting point of note that came up in the USAID conversations is along the lines of, if that's what CIP 2 focuses on, and the rest of the standards are more of how you run a CIP program and how you have controls in place, could you modify CIP 2 to apply to natural gas transmission lines and storage and LNG facilities? And that is absolutely the case. So for other infrastructure, modifying CIP 2 to be specific to whatever sector or industry you are discussing, and then looking to the remainder of the standards as the controls and standards that get put in place. Another area here within CIP 2, as we start looking at kind of all of the sets of standards, CIP 2 being the scoping standard where you are identifying which assets are in scope, CIP 3 being kind of that governance standard, 4 looking at the personnel and training, 5 the perimeters for electronic, 6 being the perimeters for physical, 7 being one of the most complex standards there are, and probably the most violated standard across NERC CIP or NERC history, and will likely remain the most violated standard of all time forever. It really has more to do with individual asset hardening and security. CIP 8 focus on incident response, CIP 9 recovery, and then you get more into the operate, maintain, kind of the change management, vulnerability assessments, information protection. These 2 standards are new. So CIP 12 looking at security between control centers, and CIP 13 really that first step towards supply chain risk management from a utility and entity perspective. And then CIP 14, nothing to do with cyber at all. So CIP 6 is physical security of the cyber assets. CIP 14 is simply physical security. And this is a result from the Metcalf substation incident, where a number of transformers were targeted and impacted with ballistics. And that kind of, that impact drove kind of the fastest standard in NERC history to be developed, with CIP 14, I think, being created within a 9-month development cycle. As we go through these kind of slide by slide, each standard, I'll talk mostly about some of the areas of interest for those on the call, with CIP 2 being this main scoping standard, so identifying which control centers, which transmission substations, generation facilities, black start facilities that are going to be in scope of your program. This is an area where we see a number of other standards, bodies, and frameworks having issues and concerns, in that they start off by telling the asset owners, you run your own risk assessment and you identify what is going to be in scope. That is absolutely where NERC CIP started many, many years ago. And after running that way for a long period of time, there was growing concerns that not enough assets were being identified as in scope. Often this is talked about as kind of entities, asset owners understanding that if they included something, they would have significant compliance risk and capital obligations to go and add security controls. So they simply avoided identifying assets. However, working in the utility industry at that time, I would say it wasn't as intentional as that. It was more of a, if we as an individual company assess our own assets and risk to the bulk power system, there's really not any single asset that you would say, if that generation unit was unavailable, we would have a significant impact and outage. If that generation plant was unavailable, it would result in a significant bulk power system event. The way the system is designed and engineered, there really isn't any single asset. So doing individual company footprint-wide risk assessments often resulted in nothing being identified that would have a bulk power impact. So over time, this is an area where CIP 2 has matured, and it's moved into an entire system-wide risk assessment being performed by the regulator. So the regulator identifying, based on studies, analysis, modeling tools, that certain assets of certain size, so generation assets of 1,500 megawatts or more, power transmission substations that have 3 or more 345 lines or 500 kilovolt lines, that those facilities would be the facilities identified as assets that are in scope and having an impact. And also the recognition that all assets, even anything that is bulk power, should have some level of protection around it. So moving away from this all or nothing approach and more into a systematic and a high, medium, low approach was one of the great kind of lessons learned over time and the benefits of CIP 2. CIP 3 has a number of kind of policies, these 9 listed here, where this is more of a governance standard. That is, if CIP 2 is setting the scope of what your CIP universe looks like, CIP 3 is really the requirement for how you are going to operate those assets for normal operating conditions as well as emergency operating conditions throughout the life cycle of those assets during factory acceptance tests and site acceptance tests to cutovers and commissioning, and then ultimately into the operate and maintain and decommissioning of those individual components. So if you're thinking of CIP 2 as a scoping standard and then setting the foundation, CIP 3 is really the policy and governance and the executive level and kind of company commitment to how you're going to operate those assets throughout their life cycle. CIP 4 is specific to the individuals within an organization. So looking at the access requests and access to an individual system or physical perimeter, and then what you're going to do with those individuals from a background check perspective, as well as an ongoing training program. So consider CIP 4 as more of the personnel management and the human component of the sets of standards. CIP 5, you can look to this as if you're going to do a couple of standards and you're going to take CIP and shrink it down and right size it for your country, kind of having CIP 2 where you're defining what is critical, and then at a bare minimum looking to CIP 5 to say, how are we providing that first line of defense? How are we providing an electronic security perimeter around those assets? And that achieves 2 things. Number 1, it forces you to create a perimeter and logically group things within that space or physically connect them that way. So it's forcing you to an inventory, and it's providing some level of segmentation and protection. As we look to CIP 6, that is the second piece of that. CIP 5 being the electronic element and CIP 6 being the physical perimeter around those assets. And the ability to have non-authorized individuals, so a visitor that may be coming to repair something or to investigate, having that full kind of escort program. CIP 7, this again, as mentioned, this is the most complex standard that is out there in regards to the number of things that must be performed on each individual asset. So if 5 and 6 are kind of your electronic and physical perimeters, CIP 7 is when you start actually hardening the individual devices and assets themselves. And this is where you start to see those challenges between IT and OT of what you can do in a traditional industrial control system asset versus what you can do in a normal workstation server environment. These standards and these requirements have been sort of written specifically to address the combination of asset types that electric utilities face. So an individual like Dean working through kind of his CIP program, he may have one very specific requirement language and governance document, and then have to figure out how they're going to implement that on a programmable logic controller in a plant, and how they're going to equally implement that on a network switch, as well as a traditional Microsoft Windows server. With those kind of standards covered and looking at how you're defending and how you're creating a perimeter and how you're hardening the asset, really CIP 8 and CIP 9 get you into an area of when those efforts have failed. So when the efforts to scope, operate, defend, and harden an asset have not succeeded, and an adversary has still found their way in, CIP 8 is where the requirement for incident response and information sharing has really come to light. What we're highlighting here is, again, some of the issues with this incident response and notification and reporting. And again, just to highlight that this is a growing and dynamic set of standards. So even the version of CIP 8 that is in place now, that has been being worked on for well over a decade and a half, we're still continuing to find areas for improvement for information sharing, for example. So in the current version of this standard, you don't have to provide, you're not mandated, you're not required to report an incident until there's been an effect, until there's been a reliability event. And that has been deemed as that's not the smartest way to operate. ideally you would be telling other peers across our infrastructure as you're seeing adversary actions before the big bad thing happens. So now a new version is coming into play that requires earlier reporting and more frequent reporting with additional details in those reports, even if a big bad event has not happened. So again, this isn't a set of standards that gets created, issued, and then we all operate to it, and we don't change and we don't grow. These standards are growing so fast and changing so fast that that creates a different problem for utilities, because they're often not done implementing one program before the next one is already coming into play. CIP 9, as mentioned, is when the big bad thing happens. This is your ability to recover. And again, so as different countries look at, if we were to pick some of these standards and not the entire thing, which ones would we pick? And certainly the scoping standard is required. The perimeter is absolutely required. Some components of CIP 7. But if you're in a state, in a country, or in an area where active compromise has already been occurring, you may look to very rapidly start looking at CIP 8 from an incident response and CIP 9 from a recovery capability. As mentioned before, kind of CIP 10 is this change management, how you're operating and developing baselines and measuring towards those baselines to detect if any unauthorized change has occurred, and performing vulnerability assessments to continue to up the game of your system hardening and kind of perimeter capabilities to identify any vulnerabilities that may exist. CIP 11, this is really focused on the information protection side. So as an adversary campaign may start by performing reconnaissance, collecting open source data, and developing an attack campaign, they're looking for data of interest that will help them gain unauthorized access and potentially cause an effect. CIP 11 is really focused on protecting those pieces of data that could help an adversary gain unauthorized access. We are approaching the end of these standards, but these two are brand new. CIP 12 really focused on where there's a control center. So where you're conducting supervisory control and data acquisition, kind of wide area system view, and more of a geographical kind of spread connectivity capability. Those capital C control centers where they may have capability to operate multiple transmission substations, they may be connected to multiple power generation assets, and then those connections between those control centers, a primary and a secondary control centers, up to reliability coordinators and balancing authorities. This is a standard that is really focusing on ensuring that the communications between those control centers is protected, is encrypted, and there are measures in place to prevent someone gaining unauthorized access to that data stream. CIP 13, this is a big one for us in North America in that we have taken a step towards supply chain. No one involved in this standard, no one involved in the industry would look to this as saying, oh, well, if we just comply with this, we're gonna satisfy and solve the supply chain problem. There's a recognition that the supply chain problem is massive. It is spread to a level from design to forging to chip manufacturing to where they go to get integrated, the potential to impact supply chain during delivery, and the potential to impact it during an operate and maintain cycle. There's lots of kind of tentacles to the supply chain problem. This standard is the first step at developing some software integrity requirements, some vendor incident notification requirements, and taking some of these first steps towards solving and dealing and managing with this issue. Last standard, and again, this is CIP by name, as it's critical infrastructure protection, but it's specific to physical security. It is not physical security of a cyber asset, it's physical security of a facility. And this is a result of direct physical impacts to a substation environment, which are often kind of middle of nowhere, long response times for law enforcement. And as a result, we've developed a set of standards to harden those assets, have earlier detection, and prioritize where capital investment dollars go from a physical security perspective. Again, this is an area where if you're in a region or a geography where there is active conflict or contested borders, physical security of substations and facilities may be something that would be of interest. with that, I'm going to stop talking for a minute and turn it over to Dean to kind of talk through some of the struggles and things that they've seen in implementing these various standards and kind of a CIP program across their service territory.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tim. So what I'm going to do is, just as Tim mentioned, I'm going to brief those areas, those standards, what we found helpful to implement and how to implement them, some challenges and some wins. So I'll touch on each one of the CIP standards as I've learned how to do it in our organization in the electric utility space. So the first one is really on the personnel management, which touches on things like the requirement to have training for the staff on the plant floor. And so we're all aware of, cybersecurity training, awareness training, for example, which says don't click on bad links, expect adversaries to come in via email. Those phishing campaigns are increasing. So, but what we're talking about here for the NERC CIP standards and critical infrastructure, it goes beyond, or should go beyond that, where you're actually going to be training and educating folks that work on the plant floor. In addition to the email information about how to handle that, it's how do they architect networks for the plant floor. When you have people coming onto the site, whether it be contractors or vendors to help troubleshoot or integrate solutions into a plant, it's how do they come on site? Do they plug in their devices, which are called transient devices, which we'll speak to later, which is one of the biggest risks we have. So it goes beyond, so CIP 4 goes beyond the personnel training for IT and really focuses on what the risks are for ICS and who should be involved with getting that training, which essentially would be contractors, plant floor workers, the engineering staff as well. With regards to the electronic security perimeter and the physical security perimeter, so that's CIP 5, CIP 6, what we have seen is understanding what's in scope. So the electronic security perimeter really focuses on, as Tim mentioned, the separation, the digital isolation or segmentation from of the critical infrastructure networks and assets from non-critical infrastructure devices and the internet. So for example, CIP 5 actually illustrates how you can set up things like a perimeter, your firewalls, to actually segment off your industrial control systems from the internet, but also from IT networks as well. And it's important to treat IT networks and the internet as hostile environments. So, having that separation and ability to monitor, but have that segmentation. So in case there's an issue with IT or the internet, for example, we can isolate and protect critical infrastructure. So that's really the security perimeter for the electronic security perimeter. And with regards to physical, when implementing that, a lot of things we found was that, again, back to scope. What's the actual physical perimeter? Is it the actual yard of the substation? Is it the plant itself? Is it at the door and then everything from the door to the assets inside? What we have found in some cases, we've had physical security perimeter set up inside an actual plant, but limited to actually just the critical components of the service. So a rack, for example, of critical devices such as switches and also PLCs, programmable logic controllers, and devices critical for that space. That being segmented off and further isolated with lock and key, for example, not necessarily an entire facility. So it largely depends on literally where the critical assets are and how you actually set up your security perimeter. For example, if you have a large site with just a small section of critical assets for the power system, if you have that entire site labeled as your physical security perimeter, that everybody in that site would have to go through the personnel management training as well, and the background checks, as we'll talk about later. Whereas if only your critical assets are in a small subsection of that building, you can isolate just to that area, reduce the onerous requirements to have everybody in the entire plant trained. So it depends on your scope, depends on how your plants are laid out as well. If we move on to CIP 007, which is, as Tim pointed out, the most violated of the CIP standards, we're really talking about things like hardening of devices and patching, and traditional AV, as an example, as a security control in IT, is not always implemented accurately or effectively on ICS. As an example, the typical traditional signature-based solutions for antivirus can really actually cause major impact in industrial control environments. So at a technical level, things like whitelisting of antivirus becomes really, really effective and easier to manage in the ICS environment rather than in IT. Patching we'll probably talk about later on if we get a moment, but in general, patching is really difficult in the ICS environment. It's not impossible, but the idea is to patch smartly. So a risk assessment really has to be kind of put around when you do patching and what assets should be patched. As an example, if you have an old legacy device buried deep in a network, not connected to IT, not connected to the internet, and it has protections around it, if that's on patch, that's not necessarily the end of the world. So mitigation controls can be put in place, etc. And so yes, I'm talking about those devices we probably can't patch, like Windows XP, etc. So there's some nuances to that, really patching smartly, not necessarily patching everything. It all depends on what's critical in your environment and what the vulnerability and capabilities of the adversary are to take advantage of that. Now, with regards to CIP 8, I really want to focus on this for a couple seconds. That's really incident response. So a lot of us are aware of the 5 or 6 steps of incident response in IT, the traditional incident response, which is great. So in ICS, we've actually leveraged that. We've built on additional components for ICS. So typically it's like the 7th or 8th or 9th step for industrial control systems incident response. And the difference primarily is really including safety. So as a quick example, if there is a compromise in IT, a basic practice would be take the system offline, image it, and then flatten the device, put it back into production. In industrial control system, the incident response is quite nuanced. It's, well, what's the actual impact? Can we triage with the system online? Can we isolate? The idea is to make sure the box can stay up to support the safety and reliability of the operations while troubleshooting and having a way to reduce the risk. One other thing I'll touch on in this section before we move on is the transient devices. So this is CIP 10, where we talk about the transient cyber assets and removable media. So I want to point out that there's several solutions from a technical and governance perspective to address these issues. I want to raise the point that transient devices still is one of the top vectors, the top ways in or risks to any plant that we have today. And the transient device really is a USB stick with it could be contaminated, but also a laptop as an example. And these contaminant devices can be introduced unknowingly. So somebody coming to the site to do troubleshooting or integrate something, that laptop that may not be owned by the plant itself, the shareholders could be introduced to malware prior to getting to your site, and then introduce that contaminant, behind firewalls, past all the security that you have put in place. So that's still one of the main threats that we see today in vectors coming into an organization. One last point before I give it back to Tim there is really on CIP 11, information protection. Now, information protection, as Tim mentioned, is just understanding what information is out there, protecting it adequately. But I want to point out that typically I see from a tactical point of view, you see an IT environment and you see an industrial control environment, and they're not always disjoint. So for example, engineers that use email, they can receive information, even configurations from vendors for the industrial control devices, the PLCs, programmable logic controllers, etc. My point is information can come into your IT environment that is deemed and should be labeled as sensitive for the ICS environment as well. You need to be cautious there. Why? Because as Tim mentioned, the adversary can learn how to build an attack from compromising the IT environment, learning what documentation are out there about the industrial control environment, and then come back to do a follow-on attack. So information that the adversary can learn about the ICS can exist on the IT space as well. So that's some of the highlights from this section. I will turn it back over to Tim now, just making sure we have some time to get through the rest of the slides and get to any questions you guys have.
Yep. Thank you, Dean. Don't go far. We'll be right back to you in a second here.
Okay.
All right. So that was the most rapid CIP basics you will get. Again, as kind of mentioned earlier, we teach a 5-day class around this subject, and we're really pushing being able to complete it in 5 days and potentially moving to a 6-day. There is so much to really dive into when you're looking at the operational components of NERC and CIP, and you're looking at the IT kind of cybersecurity and the OT cybersecurity and the blend of those. and just from a practitioner and a compliance perspective, implementing and running a program, lots and lots of things to discuss. But we've covered kind of the CIP basics, and now just for people that are kind of in between on which standard to go down the path of and kind of where the standard is from a maturity perspective, we want to talk a little bit about where the standard has a lot of strengths and why we would recommend it. Certainly for other critical infrastructure, especially in bulk power in other countries, but also potentially modifying CIP 2 and looking at leveraging some of the controls that exist in the rest of the standards. After that, we will discuss a little bit about some of the lessons learned and the areas for improvement. One component is, so this isn't how we're recommending other countries establish this or set this up, as the assets themselves are kind of owned and operated differently around the world, where here we have in North America thousands of registered electric utilities that may be providing transmission operation services, transmission owners, or generation operator, generation owner, and then another wide variety of whether they're balancing authorities, reliability coordinators, so kind of all those various functional roles that are performed. In other parts of the world, kind of the transmission system is owned and operated by the state. They're owned and operated government-wide. There's not kind of this investor-owned and operated utility perspective with hundreds of different transmission operators within a country. Here within the United States, that is our model, and up in Canada. So a functional registration and kind of areas of authority needed to be defined. With other countries, it may simply be necessary for the generation side and for the distribution side and possibly for market operations. Whereas the transmission side, the authorities are already clear. Here within North America, especially within the US for this slide, under the executive branch, kind of the Department of Energy, appearing with FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and then they delegate down to NERC. Through the Energy Policy Act that was defined in 2005. And then NERC has a series of regions, currently 6 regions that cover North America. And that is where kind of the individual audits, assessments, and enforcements, and potentially specific standards have come. As other countries look to this, this may be less complicated for you to implement, as you already may have kind of a countrywide transmission system, and you're really just looking for the authority over generation and distribution, which you could potentially name the transmission operator as the authoritative source. But having that source of authority defined and having all of the regulation and everything in place to support the authority will help with the next steps of when standards get developed and when standards get adopted, of the question of who is going to enforce them. So initially having this authority identified is critical. On the enforcement side, so when standards are first being developed and they're released, a lot of discussion is going to occur in regards to enforcement. There's a couple of different approaches. So here is an example. Initially, throughout US, the enforcement wasn't necessarily on the negative and penalty side. There was initially peer evaluations and readiness assessments performed by utilities to utilities, with areas of excellence being identified and areas for improvement being identified. So there was some incentives and kind of that learning from your peers and learning from other people conducting the same tasks. And we operated that way for a number of years with no actual financial penalties, just kind of evaluations and peer assessments before the standards became mandatory and enforceable. After the standards became mandatory and enforceable, there has been kind of a violation-focused incentive, meaning in order to avoid a violation and in order to avoid potential penalties, you would implement the standards in strict compliance in order to avoid a potential audit finding and penalty. Over time, and as the standards have matured, again, kind of conversations are starting again along the lines of incentive-based, where certain incentives could be provided to asset owners and operators to implement the standards in ways that are beyond the requirements, so doing more than what's currently required, or doing those standards in areas or facilities where they're not currently required. So just incentives along the lines of strengthening our overall position, and then also still having the mandatory enforceable sanctions in place as well. So as various countries look at kind of who is going to be the authority, and then what is going to be the penalty if an individual asset owner or operator does not do what the requirements say, those are things that you're going to want to consider. What the negative outcome is if somebody doesn't follow the standards and doesn't perform what the intent was. You may also want to consider the positive side of incentives and how you can incentivize a company's capital expenditure and operating maintenance costs, because you know as you add these requirements, you're going to be adding additional work, additional bodies, new cyber assets that need to be managed and maintained. Just quickly from a perspective, we're not looking to say you should develop your standards this way. We're looking to say currently this is how our standards are developed, in that a standard drafting team is formed. So unlike other kind of standards bodies where it may be an organization that has employees and those employees go out and make new standards and they work and draft language, across NERC and the standards development process, the teams that are developing the standards are the asset owners themselves. So the individuals who are working in this space on a daily basis and then will have to actually comply with the standards that are created, they're the same body of individuals that are drawn upon to create the standards. So there shouldn't be a utility in North America that sees a NERC standard and says, where did this come from? What crazy people came up with these requirements? And why weren't we notified? This entire standards process includes the stakeholders from the point of developing the language, drafting the standard, industry feedback components, and ultimately it's something that the industry itself ballots on and approves. And then it moves into implementation and enforcement. So this process will look differently for each country, and different infrastructure, but this process of standards developed by the industry that's going to have to implement them is probably one of the strongest things that is kind of driving the NERC standards forward. Again, that ballot capability, there's a full kind of open ballot process. All stakeholders have some transparency into the standards and the language, and the ability to ballot and affirm or kind of reject the standard and push it back through additional development and additional comments. This process can take some time, but it absolutely ensures that every stakeholder in this process had an opportunity for their concerns and their voice to be heard, and the opportunity to vote on whether they were voting for or against current language within a standard before it goes into effect and before the enforcement components begin. The other piece we'll talk about is the scope of the standards. So the main component here that NERC CIP is looking at is those real-time services that are being performed that can actually have kind of an impact in bulk power system. So again, that CIP2 scoping standard that is looking at risk across the entire service area. So each entity is no longer doing their own risk-based assessment methodology and determining whether something is critical to them or not critical to them. This is being provided. So that overarching risk assessment is being performed, and then entities that own certain assets can go and read the standards and read the criteria and identify which assets they own are in scope. In addition to that, beyond the asset types that they own, it also pertains to the services that are being provided. So the reliability services that are being performed in a real-time manner are those that are in scope. So after the fact, billing and metering and tie-outs, that is not something that's in scope. Transmission planning and forecasting and modeling for what additional capacity needs to be added to the system, which lines or which power generation assets should be built or created, that is not in the scope. So if you're thinking across these three time horizons of before, kind of ahead of time, real time, and after the fact, these standards are specific to the real-time operation of the electric system that could impact bulk power and all of the cyber assets used to do that and how to secure them. So the scope and components of CIP2 are absolutely essential and absolutely should be right-sized for each kind of country. I know in the last USAID initiative, we went through and looked and said, within CIP2, there's a number of things that are specific to the North American electric system, in that the identification of 1,500 megawatts or more is a significant bright line criteria, or 3 or more 345s, or a single 500 kV, or a single 765 line, and kind of the transmission line weighting. That's again unique to our system. So we went through that criteria and we removed those areas and specified for each country, this is where you would need to determine the thresholds that are appropriate based on your system and your interconnections. That document, I believe, was provided at the last USAID event. I will work to dig it up and send it to the organizers of this event so they can send it out to the registered attendees along with the slides. But that kind of sample CIP 002 document where you can fill in the blanks and establish your own thresholds is really, really important to a successful program that's going to be so physical, electronic, and the people who have access, and the people that are involved in all of this process, from the engineers to the operators to the compliance personnel, the IT, the OT individuals, just full range of coverage across the standards as they exist today through all of the domains. Area that Dean had mentioned is just the culture shock of implementing a common framework. And you know, as you look to the OT groups, the operational technology groups, and the IT groups, the information technology, those two groups don't always communicate very well. They don't always work very well together. And implementing a program like NERC CIP really has to knock down the borders between these groups so that they can leverage the best of both, and kind of looking down these individual silos of excellence and looking at kind of what OT can gain from IT. And the first item is admitting that you need them. So many different operational technology deployments and traditional plant floor at a generation site or at a transmission substation, they may be looking to add technologies that they've never really worked with before. They may be looking to add VPN, they may be looking to add encryption technologies, they may be looking to add kind of Active Directory and some fairly complex architectures and environments that the IT part of the organization is pretty good at, and they do frequently and often. And leveraging that skill set would be critical. Understanding kind of communications and where those communications go, and moving off of the model that has been common in a lot of traditional analog, serial, electromechanical environments, where you could say that, well, this facility is air gapped. The years have gone by, and a number of those traditional electromechanical, serial, or analog devices have moved to digital operational technology devices and have moved to more traditional network protocols and non-proprietary protocols, leveraging traditional Ethernet, and lots of parts of the organization and operations have started requiring interconnectivity and interdependence between those systems. The day of having kind of the ability to say we're air gapped, we don't have anything to worry about, as in a lot of cases passed from a technology and a communications perspective. Even if you can assure that you are air gapped from a technology and communication, you still have humans that are moving in and out of the environment with technology, with transient cyber assets, with removable media, and that air gap needs to be looked at a little bit differently. From an IT perspective, absolutely just understanding kind of the balance of compliance and security. Traditional IT organizations, where they end up having problems is they look at managing assets, and the way they do that from a dark window or from a maintenance window perspective and being able to patch, that needs to get out of their mind, because in an OT environment, especially in power, there's never a maintenance window opportunity. Even if a unit is down or a plant-wide outage is in place, there are still auxiliary systems in use. there are still other things and essential services that are up at that facility. You are never really in a, we don't have to worry about anything maintenance window. There is always assets up, there is always a risk, there's always a safety concern. And in order to work in that environment, there needs to be a lot of communications with operators, plant managers, and that is also an area where IT tends to not want to go into those environments. They don't necessarily want to leave the carpeted floors and move to the concrete floors and have conversations with plant managers and operators about, we want to do these actions, we want to patch these systems, we're going to push these antivirus signatures, having those discussions and coordinating that task. That's an area where IT needs to become more comfortable in those spaces. So across those kind of standards like NERC CIP that is mixing these cultures will force these things to occur. And in a lot of environments where they've been running these programs for some time, they start to see the benefits of leveraging those two different parts of the organization that have been traditionally separate. Another item here, and this is a very common discussion along the lines of security doesn't equal compliance, meaning I'm going to do one or the other. I'm going to either secure my environment and we don't need compliance, or I'm going to do compliance and have a checklist that I turn in, but it's not going to have any effect. And likewise, compliance doesn't equal security. So this is all very true from the perspective of NERC CIP when it started. I could easily stand on a stage or in front of a classroom and say, there were, without question, a number of utilities kind of in this option one, where they were doing very, very good security practices, cyber hygiene, perimeters, asset hardening, but they weren't documenting it very well. And they weren't running it in a programmatic way, that they were validating patches every certain specificity of days. They weren't pushing signatures with a routine schedule. They weren't managing the environment in a kind of compliant way or programmatic way, and they didn't have appropriate documentation to prove it from an audit perspective or from an enforcement perspective. But from an overall security, they were doing a lot of good things. On the counter to that, there was even more organizations in the earlier days of CIP that would run through their risk-based assessment methodology. They would say, we've looked at all the generation and transmission and control center assets we have. We've identified that if all of our stuff failed, the bulk power system would still be pretty good. So therefore, we've identified nothing as critical, meaning they're 100% compliant. They ran the risk-based assessment methodology. They identified they have nothing critical. So they're 100% compliant, but they've done nothing for security. So these were kind of the CIP of old compliance math. You know, this is statements that you'll hear across the industry, and it's true with a whole bunch of standards. Now, as CIP has progressed and matured, and you've ended up kind of into this new space where the risk assessment is being performed system-wide, a systematic set of standards, and an asset owner is being told, this is the type of asset that if you own it, you need to do the following things. So if you have something that's 100 kV or above, that would be a low asset, and you have absolutely requirements. If you have something that's 3 or more 345 lines or 1,500 megawatts of power generation or a control center, that could be a medium or a high, and you have tons of requirements to go perform. So it's forcing, at a minimum, entities to go and do an adequate inventory to see what units of property and what fixed assets they even own, to see what would be a low, what would be a medium, and what would be a high. So at an inventory level, it's creating some actionable event. After those things get identified, then there's a number of security controls that need to be performed, and you need to document it in order to prove it to an auditor when enforcement comes. So now we are in a model where these first two truths don't necessarily reflect where NERC CIP is. You're now in this new model where, in order to be compliant, you are doing some level of security, and you're using this kind of systematic risk assessment that's been provided to you, and you're doing the controls where they are required based on the applicability of CIP. Just very quickly, I'm not going to go through each one of these. This is more to give you a feel for what a normal CIP program would look like for organizations. There are a number of point-in-time tasks that need to be performed. This is kind of the magic component of that equation that I just showed on the screen. All of these things that are being performed. So within 15 calendar day intervals, you are doing sample log reviews of captured events. You're every 35 days going out and looking for security patches. You're conducting baseline reviews from a change management perspective. Calendar quarters, you're doing that security awareness training that Dean mentioned. You're verifying people's access every 15 months. So on a periodicity, a rotating kind of moving window, tons of actions here, from system information, access privileges, official training, password changes, incident response plan exercises and tests, recovery plans, exercises and tests, as well as kind of vulnerability assessments from a paper or an active perspective. Just an immense amount of things that need to be performed on very set schedules. Testing maintenance and of the physical access control systems, incident response plans for all of your assets, including low impact, and looking for vulnerability assessments, again, more of an active model, and then the personnel risk assessments and background checks. Those are all the things that you can put on calendars and schedule work around and plan tasks. Then there's a long list of things that just happen. So visitors appear, patches appear, malicious code signature updates, an actual incident occurs. The ongoing, every minute, every second of the day, monitoring physical perimeters, monitoring systems, alerting and responding. This, across the board, this is the magic in that math equation that I showed, kind of the set scheduled tasks and the as needed tasks and the ongoing tasks. This is where CIP has driven organizations to, from a staffing, from a capital investment, from an operating and maintenance, to really, really raise the bar on security and protection of a critical infrastructure. This is a downloadable poster that you can go and get from this website. And we've seen this in organizations where people have this up in their cube and they have the things that they perform checked off and they have the things kind of highlighted that are their responsibility based on their job role. Some of these things I think Dean is going to cover when he's kind of talking about what he has seen across their program. But specifically through the implementation of NERC CIP, we didn't one day put a flag in the ground and say, you must comply. There was this overall kind of implementation saying, let's start with control centers as they have the biggest risk. Then let's add in power generation and substations over time. So a multi-year implementation. Having the asset owners involved in the standards development is absolutely essential. The day the standards go in effect for a particular sector, don't immediately start issuing out $1 million fines. Have kind of the safe harbor peer-to-peer evaluation capability. Consider incentives. Consider this, we're going to tell you what assets are critical. Don't leave it up to the asset owner and operator. That's a lesson we learned 15 years ago, and we worked very hard to move away from it. We hate to see new standards and new frameworks and new regulations being created that are taking and making those same mistakes. And then absolutely focus on the real-time impacts. If you have to kind of scope this in some way, that is for sure where you should be looking. Dean, I will turn this over to you, and then our kind of final lessons learned segment is much shorter, and we'll hopefully have time for questions.
Thanks very much, Tim. That was a really good section. And from an implementation point of view, there's a lot of things I want to kind of touch on, but in the interest of time, it won't be too long through this couple moments here. So a couple of key things that Tim mentioned that I want to kind of brief on is really the blend of IT and OT. So having that relationship and strong friendship between IT and OT, as Tim mentioned, is super important. How do you get that? So what we have done, which we found extremely effective, and it's simple to implement, is we've actually, and it sounds simple and it is, we've actually rebranded internal memos, internal communications from cyber security to cyber safety. So automatically now the plants have an understanding that we as security individuals, as cyber defenders, understand that safety and reliability of operations is the utmost. Security is not in there to take over the plant. Security supports operation, periods, full stop. So if you want to get, sing-along songs around the campfire with IT and OT, having that relationship is critical. So blending it based on why security can help support operations is going to be key. Now, having said that, though, ICS has learned a lot from IT. We continue to do so. And taking what we've learned from IT and adopting it to ICS is key. Adopting it by adding safety throughout the way. If we look at all of the assets as an example that Tim mentioned, we talked about Windows devices and PLCs and other assets. As we go down from the, I'll say, list of devices in the Purdue model, for example, the top quarter is could be IT such devices like Windows devices, etc. But beyond that, the lower portion and most of the Purdue model or assets in your inventory are things like the switches specifically to the ICS components, the protocols for ICS as well. So my point is, there's a lot of assets that don't fall under the IT traditional way or labeling of IT assets. So they got to be treated very differently. So with regards to the implementation phase, though, how would you implement NERC right now? Where do you start in this vast kind of sea of standards? It's really, as Tim mentioned, starting with your high impact areas first, such as a control center. And then moving from the control center, select a substation to implement things like physical security perimeter. So that's some tangible security changes that leadership can identify with very rapidly. From a technical point of view, if you then implement the high risk segmentation, so that's CIP 05, segmentation of the assets in the environment, that's a really good way to get some quick protection in the environment. And again, having some way to reduce risk regards to the transient devices, that's CIP 10, another great way to tangibly see protection in your environment rapidly. Things like secure remote access, all those things will come as well. I want to touch quickly on patching though, before I switch it back over to Tim. I have seen electric utilities in the northern part of the world who have winters with like a lot of snow, a lot of cold weather. I've seen them not patch during the winter months at all. And of course, then they have things like a NERC CIP exception form where they document why they're not patching, et cetera. Why don't they patch? Because there's potentially a larger issue with taking down a system in winter to patch it versus keeping it up and having other mitigating controls if there are threats to certain devices and assets. So I have seen that quite frequently in the Northern Hemisphere. So with regards to resources in general, though, as Tim mentioned, there's a lot of those things that have to happen on a regular basis. Every 35 days, for example, look at what's out there for patches. Every 35 days after that, have a plan to start mitigating them. All of these things are ongoing. So resources, if you're starting to implement NERC and NERC CIP, you need resources. And it depends obviously on the size of your organization, but in general, I have seen a medium-sized electric utility hire 2 to 3 individuals specifically for documentation and auditing, and 2 to 3 individuals for technical control, implementation, monitoring of security events in the plant floor, et cetera. So expect obviously resources to be needed and required for implementation of NERC.
All right. Thank you. And for USAID, I apologize. We warned you that we may go 10 to 15 minutes over. We are absolutely going 10 to 15 minutes over. So moving into this last component on the lessons learned and fails, we'll be sort of quick here, but this is an area where regulation in general, the piles of regulation are always going to lose to ongoing active threats and dynamic adversary capabilities. This regulatory lag of seeing, hey, there's a new capability that we hadn't considered. There was a demonstrated attack. There's an attack that went after building management systems. There's an attack that went after safety instrumented systems. Those things occurring then become lessons learned that sort of drive more regulation and shape what the new standards are going to look like. It takes a long time for standards development. So that implementation piece is always going to be a problem. That's not a unique failure within NERC CIP, but it's just a failure within a standards approach and regulatory approach. As a result, you will have standards changing frequently. So here's an example of kind of early action going through 2003, then next set of standards version 1, then version 2, followed by version 3, kind of right on the heels of version 2, version 4 coming, then version 5 being released before version 4 ever went into effect, and the entire industry skipping it. Other standards continuing to progress down the path of version 6, version 7, version 8. You end up with this very, very dynamic standards body that and framework that you're trying to chase, all kind of as a result of that regulatory lag. So having an ability to develop a set of standards and then quickly modify that set of standards as needed, and then allow for an adoption period is something that absolutely needs to be considered as you're looking at different frameworks to follow. This kind of overall commitment to compliance, what that means from a culture, what it means from a investment in personnel, in support contracts with vendors, in additional staff, in training. This can't simply be a leadership level saying we will comply with an exclamation mark, and not a following investment in personnel, in technology, and in training. So that overall culture from the top down really, really needs to be kind of singing from the same song sheet and in line. Just again, kind of a summary here, kind of these interpretation inconsistencies can be very, very challenging and difficult. As different audits occur, you may be facing one auditor with one auditor interpretation, and the next time you would get different sets of auditors with different interpretations. So what one auditor may believe is compliant today, another auditor may say same program is not okay tomorrow. So driving towards consistency across the audit process and having open, transparent discussions around what compliance is really, really key. The understanding from leadership that the better your team is and the stronger your internal controls are and all of the programs that are in place will likely mean you're going to find more violations. So the more you invest in your program, the more violations you're going to discover, the more misses you're going to find. That's an area where the enforcement side of the standards needs to also recognize that. And if it's a company with strong internal controls programs that is constantly finding misses, they should be rewarded for that, not penalized for it, because they are likely finding things that the auditors never would. Again, kind of the innovation impacts, if there's a regulatory lag that hasn't considered how companies are looking to innovate and use managed services for cyber threat intelligence, for example, or using virtualized environments, the standards may have not contemplated that when they were made, and they may not specifically allow for it. So having some flexibility in what can be done and how the compliance objectives can be satisfied is key. We had a process, technical feasibility exception. I will advise you to not ever do a process like that. From a lessons learned side, this is just the ongoing auditing and kind of tracking of what devices cannot perform certain actions. So installing antivirus on a printer, on a network switch, on an RTU, and on a protection relay, those are fairly well understood. But because the requirement language was what it was, there was a large process to have to track that and prove it on a repeated basis. Instead, having a kind of whitelist of known device types that can't perform certain requirements would have been a far better way to implement that. The last piece that I'll mention here is just, we've talked about funding and incentives. We've talked about kind of this audit economy that exists with the need for a lot of different jobs and support functions. But this piece here is really kind of driving towards the culture that once there's a mandatory, sanctionable, enforceable standard in place, there can be this culture from the top and from executives where there's a greater fear of an auditor than there is of an attacker. And that is something that should absolutely, through incentive programs and through all of the other lessons learned that we've identified here on this call, should really, really be avoided across wherever these standards are implemented to the degree possible. As there's a greater fear of an auditor, it will naturally shift a program to just being more of a compliance checkbox. How do we make sure that we're satisfying what the auditors are looking for, and not focused on what are we doing from a security perspective to move beyond the baseline minimum sets of standards so we can actually defend our system. With that, I will turn to Dean to close us out.
Great, thanks very much, Tim. I think there might be a question there as well in the chat window for you, but I'll continue with this. And
Okay.
I'll address a question right now actually as well, and it's a really good question, which will highlight some of the topics I have for this next this section we just covered. And the question is, do standards require certain technologies or software? So for utilities with limited resources, can compliance become too expensive? So what I can tell you is that technology exists out there in a free form, but also paid for version that can absolutely help here as well. It'll help you be compliant. However, not necessarily all technologies for compliance is going to equal security for you. So technologies are out there. If you are budget constrained, there are free technologies that assist in some of these areas as well. But more important than the technologies that are available for you to review and install and purchase, etc., is actually having the human defenders as part of the compliance, but also the technological defense perspective. You can buy all the tools you need and want, but if you don't have people who understand the actual industrial control protocols, understand what assets are actually critical for that site or sites, it's not going to be effective. So again, this is going to sound biased, but having trained individuals who know security and the process and how the process impacts how it's effective in the plant is going to be critical for compliance and security as well. So I just want to kind of mention that. In addition to that, I do want to mention again things like resources for people. You will have to have resources for doing what Tim mentioned, which is plotting out those repetitive, repeatable processes that have to be completed in a certain specific time. So that's going to be critical. With regards to any other comments on this, again, I want to point out again, rebranding cybersecurity as safety has really helped out. With regards to the tactical defense, though, beyond the NERC CIP standards and compliance, other frameworks such as like the MITRE ATT&CK framework can really help understand what adversaries are targeting your organization. And then from that and threat intelligence, et cetera, that is how you can do more tactical security as well. So it's not the end all be all NERC CIP, but it's a major step forward and works very well across the electric sector. And I've seen it being adopted in the oil and gas sector as well. And not only in North America, but in addition to these great standards to help force us to where we need to go, the technology and the training individuals using the appropriate tools is really how we're going to do defense against the adversaries that are actually consistently coming at us. Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll flip it back over to Tim if you got a moment there. Perfect.
Sure do. Yeah, there's as the questions have been coming through, when I was talking, Dean has been responding to many, which is fantastic. So we don't have that many questions remaining that have not been responded to. There was one that was sent to me in regards to how do utilities or asset owners know or certify that they're compliant. This is an area right out the start of kind of our course where we teach that kind of whether you're compliant is in the eye of the beholder, meaning the maturity of an organization to go and look for, this is what the standard says. Now let's go validate that we have done it. We have implemented it in a manner that is satisfies the requirement language, and we've maintained that capability and that requirement throughout its entire life cycle. So on any given day, you may be compliant today with a specific requirement, and tomorrow you may not be, based on the timing of what you need to perform, all the various actions. This isn't something that you can go out and purchase, for example. You can't purchase a compliant solution that you would implement and then you would be able to check a box that you have achieved compliance. There are some vendors that sell NERC CIP compliant solutions. Probably a better way to word that, although it's less sexy from a marketing perspective, is they sell solutions that can be configured and maintained in a way that is compliant. They don't sell a solution that equals compliance. Even from the perspective of an audit, when you receive your audit kind of on a three-year scheduled cycle and a team of auditors comes in and sits across the table from you, works through every single requirement, they're not leaving the door and saying you are compliant. They are leaving and saying they found no violations, meaning they can't look at your entire program in 5 days. They can't, while they're sitting in the audit, you may have had a violation occur because your team has been working on the audit and sitting in the room with them. So they are leaving by saying we have not identified any violations. They're not leaving and saying you are compliant. So if an entire audit team working for years and sitting in an office and reviewing item by item with your team can't make a determination of whether you're compliant, certainly a vendor couldn't sell you a solution that equals compliance. Kind of the determination of whether you're compliant is an ongoing active policy enforcement program, requires a lot of kind of maturity across your organization. And definitely it's something that you would manage towards consistently. And if you are doing it to that level of effectiveness, finding violations shouldn't be kind of the end of the world. It should be a routine thing where you're finding misses and you're continuing to develop your program and improve it. I think that is what we have. There may be, I'm looking through more comments here. Dean, do you see anything that is still an open question before we end the webcast?
No, I think we've answered everything there. We'll touch on one other item above here, which is regarding the CIP 11. The question was really around how do you determine what is in scope for CIP 11, and it really comes down to the scope of your assets, what's been deemed a high, medium, or low impact facility. So yeah, the CIP 002, which is really the base of what Tim has mentioned earlier on, the first one really to kind of consider, allows you to understand which assets and which sites would be in scope for NERC CIP, and based on that, it tells you what's applicable in scope and out of scope for information related to that specific high, medium, or low facility. Yeah.
There is one last item here that I'll just point out, and it's we sort of said it in a couple of different places, but this this compliance and audit kind of economy that exists, where you have your normal tools for actual operations. So your distributed control systems, your programmable logic controllers, protection gear, large scale energy management systems, all the things that you have for performing your function as critical infrastructure, and in this case, in bulk power, all of those tools exist. As you start to layer on these standards, you end up also adopting kind of compliance management tools and document management tools and active policy enforcement tools. So all these secondary systems, all of these secondary tools and technology components that really kind of amplify the abilities of your team and of your workforce to do security and compliance in a balanced way. Again, just that should not be viewed as we purchased tool X that is a compliance tool, therefore we are compliant. Just understanding kind of where these things fit and the absolute continued need for investment in workforce and training to kind of manage all of the bots and manage all of the tools and technology that already exist in your environment. With that, I think we'll turn it back over to USAID. Again, apologies for running over, but we sort of promised you it was going to happen.
No worries at all. Thank you very much. This has been super interesting. I'm going to just end here quickly. Thank you to all of you who participated in the poll. Your participation is greatly appreciated. You'll be hearing back from us. You'll be receiving a mail from Jake shortly. We'd appreciate if you could respond to the survey there, and we'll be sending you the link to the recording of this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you will have a great weekend and join us for the rest of our webinar series. Thank you so much, and have a great weekend.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye, everybody.